February 21st, 1841. A laborer called George Sturgis is traveling to Sydney in the British colony of New South Wales with his boss's livestock. He stops near the Ironstone Bridge, just outside of the small village of Berrima, after spotting a dingo pawing at something in some broken bushes. Intrigued, he approaches to take a closer look, discovering a man lying on his back, with his skull having been smashed in from behind. George hastily alerts the Berrima police, who rush to the scene, soon identifying the man as Kearns Landrigan, a local farm worker. With several severe wounds to the back of his skull, there is no doubt that Kearns has been murdered. As their investigation begins, owner of the Woolpack Inn, John Chalker, comes forward, reporting that 2 days before the body was found, he had served Kearns at his pub alongside another farmer called John Dunleavy. John Dunleavy, it turned out, had recently taken over a farm that had previously belonged to the Mulligan family. Alarmingly, none of the Mulligan family, both parents and their 2 children, had ever been seen again after Dunleavy claimed to purchase the land from them. So the investigators headed over to Dunleavy's farm, where they found bloodstains on his shirt. He even had a wagon that perfectly matched the tire tracks found at the crime scene. Searching the property, they also found Kearns' hat and belt among a large collection of other stolen property. As you can imagine, they arrested him, accusing him of murder. But most shockingly of all, they quickly realized that John Dunleavy didn't even exist. The man they had in custody, claiming to be Dunleavy, was actually a notorious criminal known as John Lynch. Among his many crimes, Lynch had previously been implicated in another murder in 1835, which he had barely managed to avoid being executed for. As they began digging into Lynch's life and history, they soon discovered that he was linked to the murders and disappearances of at least 8 other people, with some of the stolen property found at the farm directly tying him to several open murder investigations. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Lynch remained defiant, insisting he was innocent and confident he would be cleared of all charges. On March 21st, 1842, Lynch stood trial at Berrima Courthouse and was sentenced to hang for the murder of Kearns Landrigan. As the judge condemned him, he noted, "It is now credibly believed, if not actually ascertained, that no less than 9 other individuals have fallen by your murderous hands. How many more have been violently ushered into another world remains unrecorded, save in the dark page of your own memory." Despite this, Lynch continued denying his guilt and made every appeal possible to overturn his sentence. When all avenues had been exhausted and he had no choice but to accept his fate, on the night before his execution, Lynch summoned a priest to his cell and finally confessed to his crimes. This is the story of John Lynch, also known as Born in Ireland in 1813, little is known about John Lynch's life until his conviction for obtaining goods under false pretenses, or more commonly, theft. Lynch was then transported on the convict ship Dunvegan Castle, arriving in New South Wales in 1832. At the time, New South Wales served as a penal colony where British convicts were sentenced to hard labor, normally for 7 years, after which they could choose to settle or return home if they could afford it. Once there, Lynch was assigned to work as a laborer on a number of farms, before falling in with a group of notorious outlaws called bushrangers. Lynch and his group roamed the outback, robbing and stealing, then selling the stolen goods in the surrounding area. During his time as a bushranger, Lynch became friendly with a farmer called John Mulligan, an emancipated convict who regularly helped him by acting as a fence for his stolen goods. In 1835, Lynch was working at the Oldbury farm in Argyll, run by George Barton, a temperamental alcoholic who had gained ownership of the property after marrying the widowed owner Charlotte Atkinson. Shortly after marrying her, George was ambushed on the road by a masked gang of bushrangers who robbed him of everything he had before leaving him flogged and tied to a post where he was later found. 2 members of Lynch's gang, Watt and Pickering, were apprehended and executed for the crime, but rumors circulated that Lynch was behind the assault due to a personal grudge with his cruel overseer. Not long after, another one of the convict laborers at Oldbury, Thomas Smith, was arrested for stealing a saddle, but released without charges, allegedly because he offered up information about the previous attack. Soon after his release, Smith was found beaten to death and stuffed inside a hollow tree about a mile from the Oldbury farm's convict huts. Another laborer, Michael Hoy, claimed he had seen Lynch and another worker walking off with Smith and returning covered in blood the night he went missing. With the risk of being sent to the gallows if he was found guilty, Lynch managed to mount a vigorous defense at his trial and effectively discredited Hoy during cross-examination, convincing the jury that Hoy himself actually had motive to kill Smith and was responsible. George Burton was called to testify, but showed up blind drunk and ended up getting fined himself. unable to provide any evidence for or against the accused convict laborers in his employment. Ultimately, the jury found Lynch and his accomplice not guilty and acquitted them both. Following the trial, with other charges still pending against the two men, they were sent to Hyde Park Barracks for further investigation. During his years in custody at the barracks, Lynch was stabbed in an altercation with 3 fellow inmates who attacked him during his sleep. The 3 men were tried and convicted for the crime, initially being sentenced to death, though thankfully their sentence was ultimately commuted, given Lynch years later admitted that he had stabbed himself and blamed the men out of revenge. At some point in 1841, Lynch left the barracks, with conflicting reports stating that he was either sent to return to his previous role as a convict laborer in Berrima, or that he escaped custody and fled. Whatever the reasoning, Lynch did return to Berrima, heading over to Mulligan's farm where he had supposedly left a range of stolen goods. According to Lynch, John Mulligan sold the goods, but refused to give Lynch his owed share of the sales. Swearing to himself he would return and seek vengeance, Lynch set his sights on his old employer, Oldbury Farm. Sneaking onto the farm, Lynch stole 8 bullocks and a wagon and began driving towards Sydney, planning to sell them. On his journey, he encountered a man called Edmund Ireland and a young Aboriginal boy who were transporting cattle and a wagon full of goods belonging to a man called Thomas Cowper to Sydney as well. Introducing himself under the false name Snelling, the duo agreed to travel alongside Lynch for added safety, though they would soon learn that being in Lynch's company was anything but safe. Not long into their journey, Lynch reached the conclusion that he could make significantly more profit if he killed Ireland and took all of his goods to sell instead of the stolen 8 bullocks. At night, as the group stopped to rest, Lynch laid awake and asked God for guidance on what to do next. Though he didn't specify if God answered him, by morning he had hatched his plan. As the Aboriginal boy woke, Lynch asked him to help gather the livestock. Happy to help, the boy hurried into the nearby scrub to gather up the animals, giving Lynch the opportunity to sneak up behind him and deliver a deadly blow to the back of his head with a tomahawk. In Lynch's own words, all it needed to kill him was just one tap with the tomahawk. He dropped like a log of wood. Lynch then returned to the camp where Ireland was preparing breakfast, calmly explaining that the boy had gone off to search for the bullocks, so they should eat without him. As Ireland began serving food, he turned his back to Lynch, allowing him to smash his head with the same tomahawk. With Ireland lying dead and bloody at his feet, Lynch then sat down and ate the breakfast he had just cooked. When finished, he dragged their bodies about 100 yards into the bush, placed them in a rocky crevice, and covered them with stones. Lynch released his original 8 bullocks, sending them back in the direction of Oldbury Farm, and took over Ireland's herd himself, given they were loaded with goods to sell. Calm and collected, convinced God was watching over him, Lynch stayed at the camp for a further 2 days, despite the 2 bodies being buried right beside it. On the 2nd day, 2 men transporting their own group of horses, Laga and Lee, arrived and joined him, spending the night eating, drinking, and singing, unaware of what Lynch had done. According to Lynch, he was initially planning to kill the men and steal their goods too, but because he had enjoyed their company so much, he decided against it. The next morning, Lynch and his 2 new companions decided to continue their journey together. As they neared the outskirts of Sydney, the 2 new companions headed on without him. Soon after, a man rode up beside him and demanded to know why Lynch was in possession of his animals and his goods. This man was Thomas Cowper. Thinking fast, Lynch claimed that Ireland had been injured and that he had taken over to help complete the journey, while the Aboriginal boy assisted in bringing Ireland back home. Relieved, Cowper thanked the man who had murdered his employees and stolen his goods, accepting Lynch's offer to continue taking the load to Sydney while he went back himself to check on Ireland and the boy. They agreed they would meet in town in a few days' time, and Cowper rode off. Lynch then rode non-stop through the night, ensuring he reached Sydney way ahead of schedule. Making sure he wouldn't be tied to the sale of the goods, Lynch paid a drunkard to sell them on his behalf, planning to claim the goods had been stolen from him if authorities ever questioned him. When Lynch failed to meet him as planned, Cowper realized he had been deceived and placed advertisements seeking information about the missing wagon and its cargo. His search led him to a horse's bridle and some bacon that had been sold, but the trail went cold at that point. Meanwhile, Lynch had pocketed the money from the sales and hurried out of town with the cart and bullocks. As he neared the location he had murdered Ireland and the Aboriginal boy, he spotted a father and son, William Fraser and his son William Jr. The pair were heading to Berrima with cargo for Samuel Bawtry, so Lynch began traveling the roads with them, joining another camp with 2 married couples at Bargo Brush. The moment Lynch settled down to sleep, a police constable rode into their camp. inquiring if anyone had seen the stolen wagon and bullocks that Lynch was riding with. For some reason, Fraser told the officer he hadn't seen it and he knew nothing about it. Failing to spot Lynch, the officer rode off, satisfied. Shocked, Lynch saw it as another sign that God was on his side, later describing it as a miracle. Despite the fact that Fraser had just saved his life, as Lynch lay on the ground, he again spoke to God, who he claims informed him that he needed to get rid of the Cowper's bullocks and wagon, before killing the Fraser family and taking their wagon and horses for himself. So during the night, Lynch quietly set the bullocks free, reporting them missing the next morning to the Frasers. Asking for their help to hide his wagon till he could return with more animals, the Frasers assisted him, completely unaware of Lynch's true intentions. After concealing the wagon as best they could, the Frasers offered to give Lynch a lift. After a day of traveling, they set up camp for the night, and in the morning, Lynch carried out a near-identical plan to his first murderous scheme. He lured William Jr. out to help look for the horses, before approaching him from behind and striking him in the back of the head with a single blow from his tomahawk. Returning to the camp, Lynch told his father that his son was out looking for the horses. Then, Lynch signaled that he could see his son approaching, causing Fraser to turn around. As soon as he did, Lynch struck him in the back of the head with his tomahawk, instantly killing him. Thanking God for his guidance and for overseeing the successful murders, Lynch then dragged both bodies into the bush, retrieved a spade, and buried them in shallow graves. The following morning he set off toward the nearby Mulligan farm. Whether his intent was to sell his stolen goods or to settle an old grudge is unknown. Samuel Bawtry, who the Frasers were working for, initiated a search for information regarding them and his missing cargo, which led to the discovery of Cowper's cart, found hidden in the bush. It didn't take long for authorities to connect the thefts from both Cowper and Bawtry, leading to the belief that the Frasers, along with Edmund Ireland and the unnamed Aboriginal boy, had all been robbed and likely murdered by the same person. Their investigations led to a description of their suspect, Lynch, but by chance, or perhaps as Lynch would claim, divine intervention. He had used the name Snelling several times on his journey, and a man called Snelling just so happened to also meet the description. Snelling was arrested, alongside two other men called Bailey and Brown, who had actually encountered Lynch on his journey, giving Lynch even more time to evade capture or identification. Bridget Mulligan was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of their farmhouse when she spotted Lynch approaching. Knowing full well who he was, Bridget questioned where he got the horses and wagon he had presumably come to try and sell to her husband, John. Instead, Lynch told her that he had actually come to collect the £30 that John owed him for the stolen goods from before. With John coming home soon, Lynch walked over to the nearby Black Horse Inn to buy some rum, thinking that a few drinks might help convince John to pay what he supposedly owed. Little did John know, Lynch had already made up his mind about what was going to happen that day. If John Mulligan didn't pay him the £30, he was going to kill him and his entire family. When he returned, John and Bridget were waiting for him together on the porch. Sitting and joining them, Lynch opened the rum and the three of them drank and chatted into the evening. But when Lynch tried to bring up the money owed to him again, and John attempted to reason and negotiate, Lynch made his decision. The Mulligan family had to die. First, he lured their teenage son Johnny out into the woods under the guise of cutting wood for the fire, given it was a chilly night. Once out of sight, he struck the boy in the back of the head with his tomahawk, killing him. When he returned to the house, he told Bridget that Johnny was setting his horses up in the paddock. But as time passed and her son didn't return, Bridget began to grow worried. Hearing the commotion as they called out to Johnny with no response, John Sr. grabbed his gun and headed out to look for him. But this was a huge mistake, as Lynch followed him towards the bushes and, wasting no time, hit the armed man in the back of the head with his tomahawk, killing him too. A moment later, he noticed Bridget approaching where her son's body was. Needing to act fast, Lynch hurried over and tripped her, knocking her to the ground. As she lay helpless, he raised his tomahawk and swung it down at her, killing her too. Finally, having killed the rest of the family, Lynch moved into the house, axe in his hand, to find their 14-year-old daughter Mary. As he crept inside the building, floorboards creaking beneath his boots, he found the young girl standing in the kitchen, trembling as she clung to a butcher's knife after seeing what he'd just done to her mother. According to Lynch, Mary stood frozen behind a table, ignoring his demands for her to drop the knife. Unable to even speak due to fear of the blood-soaked murderer, Lynch easily disarmed her, telling her he didn't want to kill her, but he had no choice after what she'd seen. Then, Lynch proceeded to sexually assault her, before telling her to get on her knees and pray. When Mary obliged, he walked behind her, telling her, Life is full of trouble, and you'll be better off dead, before he hit her in the back of the head with his tomahawk. Lynch then gathered up the bodies of the Mulligan family, piled them up outside, and set them on fire. In his own words, they burnt like bags of fat. Alongside the bodies, Lynch burnt all of the family's possessions, before burying the remains nearby. He then arranged for an advertisement in the Sydney Gazette, which claimed Bridget had left home without her husband's consent, taking all his money, and so he needed to sell the farm. Still posing as John Mulligan, he sent letters to creditors, telling them he had sold the farm's lease to a man named John Dunleavy for £700, forging a deed. With everything in place, Lynch took over the new identity of John Dunleavy. And to his surprise, nobody questioned any of it. Nobody even came looking for the Mulligans. Once again, he took it as proof that God was protecting and watching over him. With this divine protection, he was free to do anything and everything he wanted. Soon, he hired the Barnetts, a married couple, to manage the farm while he handled trips to sell the produce. Although the Barnetts had previously known Lynch by his real name, they were instructed to call him Dunleavy. Lynch later confessed that he had chosen them because he considered them to be naive and believed he would be safe with them. And for the next 6 months, he lived a normal life under this new identity, earning the trust of his workers and creditors, and gaining a reputation as a skilled and kind-hearted farmer. Yet, as you already know, Lynch's murder spree had not stopped yet, and it would be his next murder that would be his undoing. While returning from Sydney, Lynch encountered Kearns Landrigan and offered him a job building fences on the farm. Exactly what happened after that is unclear, but for one reason or another, Lynch changed his mind about Kearns and decided he needed to die. The two men had dinner together at the Woolpack Inn, where multiple people, including the pub owner, recognized them. Later, he drove Kearns to Ironside Bridge and set up camp. As they talked and laughed, Lynch crept up behind him and struck him in the back of his head with the tomahawk. This time, the blow didn't kill him instantly. It took several more blows to the back of the head for him to die. Lynch then robbed him, taking his money and a handful of items, and returned to his farm. Unlike his previous murders, he left multiple witnesses and a range of incriminating evidence. He didn't even bother to create an alibi for Kearns' whereabouts, despite being seen with him the day he disappeared. According to Lynch, by this point he was so convinced of his divine protection that he no longer saw the need. He was never going to be caught. But as you know from the opening of this video, he could not have been more wrong. Kearns' body was found on the morning of February 21st by a laborer named George Sturgis, who noticed a dingo pawing at some damaged bushes. Finding the body, he immediately contacted local law enforcement, who arrived to investigate and discovered cart tracks at the scene. Especially notable because one wheel had seized, leaving a distinct mark. The body was taken to the local morgue, and authorities issued a call for anyone who could identify it. John Chalker, who operated the Woolpack Inn along the trail and was familiar with most travelers in the area, came forward. He recognized Landrigan and informed the police that the deceased man had recently stopped by his pub for a meal, accompanied by John Dunleavy, where he spoke about starting a new job for Dunleavy. As a result, the police went to the former Mulligan farm to arrest Dunleavy, where they noticed blood on Lynch's shirt, which Lynch claimed was from an insect bite. Meanwhile, an officer spotted a cart on the property and, upon inspection, found that its track width matched the cart tracks at the murder scene, including the distinctive stuck wheel. The final piece of evidence confirming their suspicions was a hat discovered in the house, which was identified as belonging to Kearns as he had been wearing it when he visited the Woolpack Inn. Lynch's misfortunes continued when he was imprisoned in Berrima. During a search of the Mulligan farm, authorities uncovered not only a belt, which Kearns' brother identified as his, but also items reported stolen from the wagons belonging to both Cowper and Bawtree. It didn't take long for police to identify Dunleavy as John Lynch, with the old police chief instantly recognizing him from his previous murder trial. As he was formally charged with the murder of Kearns Landrigan, authorities found a number of witnesses indicating he had been seen traveling with Ireland and the Aboriginal boy, and the Fraser father and son, before they were seemingly robbed and murdered. Suspecting he had murdered the Mulligan family and stolen their farm too, police began excavating the farm in search of bodies. Before long, they uncovered human bones, including teeth, buried among the potatoes, which Lynch claimed could not be proven to belong to the Mulligans. Thomas Cowper was called to examine the stolen loot found at the Mulligan farm, and was able to confirm that a shotgun and a number of clothing items were his property and stolen from the wagon Ireland was driving. Seeing Lynch at the jail, Cowper instantly identified him as the man he'd seen driving the wagon. resulting in Lynch shouting abuse at him and having to be restrained. To pay for his defense, Lynch tried to claim his various belongings and land could be sold on his behalf, but the courts denied his request, given the farm and the valuables he wanted to sell were items alleged to be stolen from the very people Lynch was accused of murdering. And so, on March 21, 1842, the trial of John Lynch began for the murder of Kearns Landrigan. The trial lasted for 12 hours and drew a large crowd. Throughout it, Lynch cross-examined the multiple witnesses himself, trying to undermine their credibility, presumably hoping for a repeat of his last murder trial where he was ultimately acquitted. He argued that the belt had been planted in his home by Kearns's brother, and claimed that the hat was his own, but when he tried it on in court, it was evident that it was too large for him. Lynch maintained that Kearns had left him on the road after stating he had misplaced his money, promising to return to the farm after searching for it. He also claimed to have purchased the farm from the Mulligans using an inheritance sent from family back in Ireland. Despite what observers described as a convincing performance by Lynch, the jury found him guilty. 2 days later, the judge delivered the following speech as he sentenced him to death. "John Lynch, the trade in blood which has so long marked your career is at last terminated, not by any sense of remorse or the sating of any appetite for slaughter on your part, but by the energy of a few zealous spirits. It is now credibly believed, if not actually ascertained, that no less than 9 other individuals have fallen by your murderous hands. How many more have been violently ushered into another world remains unrecorded, save in the dark page of your own memory. By your own confession, it is admitted that as late as 1835, justice was invoked on your head for a frightful murder committed in this immediate neighborhood. Your unlucky escape on that occasion has, it would seem, whetted your tigrine relish for human gore, but at length you have fallen into toils from which you cannot escape. The wily cunning, the artful devices, the blustering impudence which have so long sustained you in the pursuit of a lawless life, can no longer serve your turn. The sentence of the law is that you be taken hence to the place from whence you came, when you are to be taken to such place, on such day, as His Excellency the Governor shall appoint, and be hanged by the neck till you are dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul." Surprisingly, Lynch adamantly and emotionally pled for the court not to punish his employees, the Barnetts, who were being held in custody, for any crimes, as anything he had been accused of occurred before they started working at the farm for him. When the press discovered that George Barton's drunkenness had been a key factor in Lynch being acquitted at his previous trial, thus allowing him to commit his spree of murders, they published endless scathing articles about him, making out he was at least partially responsible for what Lynch went on to do. Public sympathy grew for the surviving members of the Fraser family, which included a widow, 2 daughters, and a young son. To assist them in their time of need, a public subscription was organized, ultimately raising over £115 for them. Despite only being convicted of 1 murder, the suspects that were being held in respect to several of the other cases were all released after Lynch's trial, with police confident in the evidence tying Lynch to every one of them. Throughout his arrest and trial, however, Lynch never wavered in his claim that he was innocent, attempting to explore every avenue for a retrial once he was convicted, still convinced that God was going to protect him from death. Eventually, though, on the day before his execution, realizing God was not going to intervene and rescue him, Lynch finally confessed to all his crimes. He summoned Reverend Summers, telling him about every person he had murdered, and giving details to help find the missing bodies. He was even taken to the Mulligan farm to show the police where he had buried the bodies, even though they had already located the remains. On April 22, 1842, John Lynch was taken to the gallows at Berrima jail and executed. Observers claimed he showed no fear of death and showed no sign of remorse for his actions. Soon after his death, the bodies of the Frasers were discovered exactly where Lynch claimed he had buried them, allowing them to be interred in the All Saints Anglican churchyard. It took almost another month for authorities to locate the bodies of Edmund Ireland and the unnamed Aboriginal boy, despite them also being exactly where Lynch had revealed they were. Surprisingly, it took until 2019 for a plaque in the All Saints Anglican churchyard in Berrima to be erected, commemorating the graves of the 6 local victims. A small, tranquil village with a population of around 600, which was less than half of that at the time of Lynch's crimes. The plaque is an odd reminder that Berrima, filled with arts and crafts shops, a museum, and even Australia's oldest hotel, holds a dark past as the hunting ground of Australia's earliest known serial killer. John Lynch was known to carry his tomahawk with him at all times. While a firearm might have been a more practical weapon for his crimes, Lynch chose to use the same tomahawk to murder all 9 of his confirmed victims, earning him the nickname, the Berrima Axe Murderer, in the press at the time. And with that, our exploration of this historical serial killer case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to help it in the algorithm. If you found this case interesting and know of any other historical or modern true crime cases you think would be just as interesting to see me explore on the channel, feel free to let me know down below. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss.